KKK burned Bumpy Johnson's best friend alive while he listened on phone. All six burned in 6 days. He heard it through the receiver before the smell hit the air. Screams, smoke, the finality of fire. 6 lives vanished in 6 days, and Bumpy Johnson didn't flinch. The phone rang once, twice. Then the voice came through, ragged, desperate, barely holding on to sound. Bumpy Johnson listened, silent, unmoving, while fire ate his friend alive on the other end of the line. He didn't curse. He didn't shout. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply held the receiver and let the voice fill the room with the weight of what had been lost. Every scream, every cough, every crackle of flame was cataloged, filed, and understood. The man he considered family, the one who had stood beside him for decades, was gone, taken in terror and fire, and the city had already started to tremble. Outside, Harlem moved as it always did, but in the small apartments and corner stores, people paused mid-step, ears straining for details they were afraid to hear. Bumpy's silence filled the gaps. He didn't ask for the story to be repeated. He already knew the measure of pain, the depth of outrage, and the exact ledger of consequences the Klan had begun writing in flames. He hung up the phone and let the receiver rest. Nothing changed. The city didn't quake at his feet. He didn't pace. He didn't throw furniture. Calmness wasn't an absence of fury. It was a presence, dense and inescapable. And Harlem felt it. He walked to the window. Smoke curled on the horizon, distant but visible, a reminder that terror was real and that it had a name. The Klan had sent a signal, one meant to intimidate, to humiliate, to measure the strength of men like Bumpy Johnson. He didn't flinch. A neighbor leaned out a window across the street. A boy ducked behind a barrel. Mothers clutched children closer. All of them understood, even without words. The quiet man in the building was already calculating. Every loss, every act of fire, every threat was being noted. And Bumpy Johnson would answer, not with chaos, but with inevitability. The city exhaled in fragments, waiting, but they didn't need to know the plan. They only needed to know he was aware. That was enough. Silence, patience, and the weight of a man who could make an entire neighborhood obey without raising his voice. That was the measure of Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy moved through Harlem as though the streets themselves whispered in his ear. Every corner held a story, every stoop a witness, every alley a potential misstep. He didn't rush. He didn't announce himself. He simply walked, letting the city reveal the signs of fear and arrogance that the Klan had left behind. Storekeepers straightened, eyes flicking to him briefly, then down, understanding without words that authority had arrived. Mothers paused with children in tow, stepping aside, but keeping watch. Boys tossing balls halted mid-throw, sensing that the rhythm of the street had changed. Even the old soldiers, leaning on canes, nodded subtly, acknowledging the presence of the man who carried the weight of a neighborhood on his shoulders. Bumpy observed every shadow, every hesitant step. He cataloged them in his mind like pieces on a chessboard. Who feared him, who misunderstood, who had looked too closely at the fires. The Klan thought their terror could be measured in speed, in smoke, in screams. Bumpy knew it could be measured only in silence, in calculation, in patience. He stopped briefly outside a small cafe, letting the quiet settle. A man who had seen the first fire flinched at his glance, and Bumpy's eyes met his for a single heartbeat. No words, just understanding. The message was clear. Miscalculation carried a price, and he knew how to enforce it without spectacle. Every alleyway whispered rumors. Every rooftop carried eyes. The neighborhood had begun speaking in a language only Bumpy could fully read. Names, movements, the timing of fear, all of it was visible to him. And the Klan, arrogant in their ignorance, had no idea how far their reach had already been contained. By the end of the day, Harlem itself had shifted. The air carried a tension that wasn't panic, but respect. People moved differently, spoke differently, even breathed differently. And Bumpy Johnson walked through it all, calm and unbroken, measuring his enemy not by their threats, but by the space they had left themselves to air. The fires had begun, but the reckoning was still in his hands. The pattern was impossible to ignore. 6 targets, 6 days. Each fire, each scream, each act of terror a mark in the ledger of the clan's arrogance. Bumpy Johnson cataloged everything, not with panic, not with rage, but with the precision of a man who understood the weight of inevitability. He traced each name, each connection, each movement through the neighborhoods. Harlem whispered in fragments. Which blocks had seen smoke rise first, which men had vanished quietly, and which families clutched children closer than usual. The terror was meant to ripple outward, to fracture, but Bumpy's calm contained it, folding it into a map only he could read. At the first fire, he had arrived late. The smoke had cleared, the flames reduced to ash, and the man was gone. At the second, he observed the neighbors' reactions, noting who faltered, who whispered, who had begun to understand the true measure of menace. Each subsequent fire became a puzzle, each loss a signal, and Bumpy moved through it all like a shadow, unhurried, untouchable. Inside his apartment, he sat at a small desk. Fingers traced each name on a ledger, notes and margins, alliances, resentments, possibilities. He did not speak aloud. He did not curse. The fires themselves were voices enough, and the clan, ignorant of the forces they had awakened, had written themselves into his plan without ever realizing it. By the 4th day, the city began to murmur differently. Men who had once felt invincible hesitated in their steps. The air shifted. Even those who had not witnessed the flames could feel the invisible pressure, the quiet dominance of a man who moved without spectacle, but carried consequence in every gesture. Every loss, every ember, every scorched doorstep was a message. Not of vengeance yet, but of control. Bumpy Johnson had drawn the map. The enemy had lit the fires, and the reckoning, slow and measured, had already begun. Harlem watched without seeing, and in the shadows, Bumpy waited. Not to strike recklessly, but to restore the balance that terror had attempted to destroy. The streets were silent in a way Harlem rarely allowed. Windows stayed closed, doors cracked just enough to peer through, and every footstep echoed louder than usual. The city seemed to lean forward, collectively holding its breath, waiting for what it already knew was coming. Bumpy walked without haste. His coat hung straight, his hat low, eyes scanning the crowd without accusation or threat. Mothers gripped their children tighter. Storekeepers lingered behind counters, hands resting lightly on cash drawers as if they might need to close quickly, or not at all. Old soldiers, leaning on worn canes, nodded subtly, understanding that the rhythm of fear had changed. The clan had miscalculated. They thought noise and chaos would cover them, that the terror of fire could drown out consequence. But Harlem's eyes were sharp, and Bumpy's presence sharper. The city understood the rules now. The man who did not shout, who did not run, who did not brandish weapons, was already in command. People paused mid-activity. Children froze mid-step, their games forgotten. 2 women carried baskets of laundry and stopped, glancing toward the stoop where Bumpy lingered for a moment. Not to see them, but to measure the weight of their loyalty. It was not fear that held them. It was recognition. Even the clan operatives felt the change. They moved more carefully, spoke less, and measured the distance between themselves and the man who could, with silence alone, command a crowd of hundreds. Their arrogance faltered under the invisible pressure of a neighborhood aligned, waiting quietly for justice to arrive. Harlem had learned to watch, to listen, to understand that action was not always necessary. Sometimes, the stillness itself could be weaponized, and the enemy could be broken without a single gunshot fired. Bumpy Johnson continued down the street, calm as ever. Every step he took reinforced the lesson. Respect, restraint, and authority carried farther than fire, louder than screams, and more enduring than violence. The city exhaled only when he passed, and even then, only in fragments. Bumpy Johnson arrived at the heart of the tension with the same unhurried pace he had walked the streets all week. No shouting, no flashing weapons, no dramatic gestures, just presence. And that presence alone commanded the room. He made calls short, deliberate, authoritative. Each connection he touched shifted the balance. Stores opened or closed at his suggestion. Men in alleys paused, considering whether to step forward or wait. The clan's shadows, once confident, now moved cautiously, uncertain of the invisible lines Bumpy had drawn. Inside a dimly lit backroom, 6 men waited, whispering among themselves. Bumpy entered. The air thickened instantly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look angry. He didn't ask for loyalty. It was assumed. He simply placed a hand on the ledger of names before him, glancing briefly at the burned streets outside, and the room fell silent. The Klan man who had orchestrated the first fire met his gaze. Panic flickered for a heartbeat, then froze. Bumpy said nothing. His silence spoke louder than any gunshot. Every man present felt it. The weight of inevitability, the understanding that the rules had been set and that crossing them carried consequences beyond comprehension. No one moved. No one whispered. Even the police stationed nearby understood the space he occupied. Control did not require spectacle. Authority did not demand fear through violence. Calm, measured, unstoppable, it radiated from him, a force that could reorder neighborhoods without firing a shot. By the end of the 3rd day, Harlem itself had bent subtly to his will. Shops reopened, children ran again, and mothers exhaled quietly, carrying with them the knowledge that Bumpy Johnson had restored balance. The fires had ended, but the lesson remained. Calm dominance, patience, and the quiet exercise of power were enough to reshape the city. Harlem was alive again, but it was different now. The air held respect. The streets remembered. And the man who had walked among them, silent and controlled, had proven that restraint could be more powerful than rage. The smoke had cleared. The streets were quiet, almost reverent. The fires that had consumed 6 lives were cold, leaving only ash and memory behind. Harlem breathed differently now, carrying a collective understanding that authority could be exercised without violence, that respect could command what terror could not. Bumpy Johnson walked slowly through the neighborhood, his steps measured, his eyes calm. People paused as he passed. Children stopped mid-play. Elders straightened in their seats. Shopkeepers leaned out to watch him move. None dared speak unnecessarily, yet every glance, every slight nod, acknowledged his presence and his triumph. Not of brute force, but of principle. Ruby had survived in memory and in story. The names of the 6 lives lost whispered carefully among those who remembered. The Klan had acted to intimidate, but their arrogance had only confirmed the city's allegiance to Bumpy. In the absence of spectacle, a quiet code had taken root. Loyalty to the community, restraint in action, and justice measured in patience. In small apartments, in stoops under fading lamplight, people told fragments of the story. None exaggerated. None needed to. The city knew. Bumpy Johnson had turned terror into lesson, violence into restraint, and fear into enduring order. Even the police, once watchful for lawlessness, now understood that some power could not be policed. It commanded obedience by presence alone. The man himself said little. He didn't gloat, didn't demand recognition. He walked past the scorched blocks, past the charred doors, past the whispered remnants of fear, leaving behind a legacy heavier than any gun, louder than any scream. Harlem would remember, not the flames, not the loss, but the principle he had enforced: calm, measured authority, unyielding in its subtlety. As night fell, the neighborhood exhaled fully for the first time in days. Bumpy stood briefly at a corner, gazing at the quiet streets, letting the weight of what had occurred settle. The lesson was clear, and it would endure. In every whispered story, in every cautious glance, in every silent acknowledgement, Harlem carried the memory of his power, not in destruction, but in restraint. He turned, walked into the darkness, and left the city changed, not through violence, not through spectacle, but through presence, principle, and the undeniable certainty that Bumpy Johnson's way was the way to be remembered.